The sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Wyoming Territory as Nathan Blackwood knelt before the simple wooden cross marking his wife's grave. The weight of his grief, heavier than the worn leather saddlebags slung over his shoulder. It had been exactly 1 year since he'd laid Sarah to rest in this quiet valley beneath the shadow of the Grand Tetons, far from the violence and chaos that had claimed her life. Nathan ran his calloused fingers along the inscription he'd painstakingly carved into the cross. Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, 1849–1872, beloved wife. The wood had weathered some since he'd placed it there, but the words remained clear, a testament to the love that still burned within him despite his best efforts to extinguish it. He placed a handful of wildflowers at the base of the cross, the same variety that had grown around their modest homestead when Sarah was alive. She had loved them, saying they reminded her that beauty could thrive even in the harshest conditions. Nathan had scoffed at such notions back then, too consumed with the daily struggles of carving out a life in the frontier to appreciate such sentimentality. Now, he would give anything to hear her wax poetic about flowers, sunsets, or any of the other simple pleasures she had tried to make him see. "I am sorry," he whispered, the words carried away by the spring breeze. "I should have listened to you, should have taken you back east like you wanted." The wind offered no absolution, and the mountains stood silent witness to his regret. Nathan stood, dusting the dirt from his worn denim pants, and adjusted his hat against the glare of the setting sun. It was time to return to his lonely cabin a mile north of the valley. There was livestock to tend and repairs that couldn't wait, regardless of the hollowness in his chest. As he mounted his dappled gray stallion, Storm, Nathan cast one final glance at the solitary grave. Sarah had loved this valley with its sweeping views and abundant wildlife. In the year since her death, he had visited every week without fail, watching the seasons change around her final resting place. It was a ritual that brought both comfort and pain, a wound he refused to let heal. "Let's go, boy," he murmured to Storm, turning the horse toward home. The ride back was quiet but for the rhythmic sound of hooves against earth and the occasional call of birds preparing to roost for the night. Nathan had grown accustomed to silence in the past year, had almost made his peace with it. Almost. As the cabin came into view, Nathan's brow furrowed. There was smoke rising from the chimney, which was impossible since he'd let the fire die out before leaving that morning. Someone was in his home. Instinctively, his hand moved to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. Since Sarah's death at the hands of raiders, he'd learned the hard way that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. He dismounted 100 yards from the cabin, tethered Storm to a tree, and approached cautiously, moving from tree to tree for cover. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was definitely inside. Drawing his revolver, Nathan circled to the back door, the one that creaked least. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and burst through the door, weapon raised. "Don't move," he commanded. A startled cry answered him as a woman spun around from the stove, nearly dropping the kettle she held. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with auburn hair hastily pinned up and wide brown eyes that registered fear but not guilt. "Please," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious alarm. "I mean no harm." Nathan kept his revolver trained on her, taking in her dusty traveling clothes and the small carpet bag by the door. "Who are you and what are you doing in my home?" "My name is Bethany Wilson. I was told this cabin belonged to the Blackwoods." Her eyes darted to the gun, then back to his face. "The stagecoach driver said you sometimes took in travelers who missed the connection to Jackson." Nathan's jaw tightened. "That was before. Who told you to come here, mister?" Jenkins, from the general store in town, said it wasn't safe for a woman to camp alone and that Nathan Blackwood was honorable if a bit. She hesitated, solitary these days. Jenkins. Nathan should have known the old shopkeeper would still be sending strays his way, despite Nathan's insistence that those days were over. Sarah had been the hospitable one, always ready with a hot meal and clean sheets for travelers caught between towns. Nathan had tolerated it for her sake. Slowly, he lowered his weapon but didn't holster it. Jenkins is mistaken. I don't take in travelers anymore. The woman Bethany nodded as though she'd expected as much. I understand. I'll gather my things and be on my way. She set down the kettle and reached for her bag, but her knees suddenly buckled, and she caught herself on the edge of the table. Nathan instinctively moved forward, his free hand gripping her elbow to steady her. Are you hurt? Just tired, she replied, though the paleness of her face suggested otherwise. I've been traveling for 3 days straight from Denver. The stagecoach ride was rough. Against his better judgment, Nathan found himself holstering his weapon. Sit, he said gruffly. Finish making that tea. You can rest here tonight, but come morning you'll need to move on. Relief flooded her features. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I truly appreciate your kindness. It's not kindness, he corrected, moving to stoke the fire she had started. Just common decency, and it's Nathan. Bethany nodded, returning to her task of preparing tea. Nathan watched her surreptitiously as he added wood to the fire. There was a quiet efficiency to her movements, a lack of wasted effort that spoke of someone accustomed to hard work. Her clothes, though travel-worn, were of good quality, and her speech marked her as educated. What brings you to Wyoming Territory? He asked, more to break the uncomfortable silence than out of genuine curiosity. Bethany poured hot water into 2 chipped mugs before answering. A fresh start, she said simply, offering him one of the mugs. My husband died last winter, influenza. There was nothing left for me in Denver but memories. Nathan accepted the tea with a nod of thanks, recognizing the familiar hollow tone that came with speaking of lost loved ones. And you chose here, of all places. I have a distant cousin in Jackson who offered me a position teaching at the new school they're establishing. A small smile crossed her face. I've always wanted to teach. Nathan grunted in acknowledgement, sipping the tea. It was good, stronger than he usually made it, but bracing after the long day. Your wife, Bethany said carefully. Mr. Jenkins mentioned she passed. I'm sorry for your loss. Nathan stiffened. Jenkins talks too much. People tend to in small towns. She looked around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the layer of dust on the shelves, the empty spaces where Sarah's touches had once been. How long has it been? A year. The word felt inadequate to measure the vastness of Sarah's absence. Raiders came through while I was in town. She tried to defend our home. Bethany's eyes softened with understanding. My Thomas fought until the end, too. The doctor said most men would have succumbed to the fever days earlier, but he held on, stubborn as always. For a moment they sat in silence, 2 strangers united by grief. Then Nathan stood abruptly, uncomfortable with the unexpected intimacy of shared loss. You can take the bed, he said, gesturing to the small bedroom off the main living area. I'll sleep by the fire. Bethany opened her mouth as if to protest, but seemed to think better of it. Thank you. I truly am grateful. Nathan nodded stiffly and busied himself with preparing a makeshift bed on the floor while Bethany gathered her bag and retreated to the bedroom. Once she had closed the door, he allowed himself to exhale, unsettled by the presence of another person in the home he had shared with Sarah. As he stretched out by the dying embers of the fire, Nathan wondered what Sarah would think of his reluctant hospitality. She would have welcomed Bethany warmly, drawn out her story, made her feel at home. Sarah had possessed a gift for making people feel seen and valued, a gift Nathan had never shared. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of Sarah's smile turning to terror as raiders descended upon their home. Nathan woke before dawn, as was his habit, to find Bethany already up and moving quietly around the kitchen. "Good morning," she said softly. "I hope I didn't wake you. I thought I might prepare breakfast before I continue on my way." Nathan sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "There's not much to prepare. Some bacon and coffee is about all I have." "That's more than enough." Bethany was already stoking the fire in the cook stove. "I noticed your garden out back has gone a bit wild. There are still some early greens that could be salvaged, if you don't mind me gathering a few." The garden had been Sarah's pride. Nathan had let it grow over in the months following her death, unable to bring himself to tend to it without her. "Help yourself," he said, rising to his feet. While Bethany ventured outside, Nathan washed at the basin by the door, the cold water chasing away the last vestiges of sleep. By the time she returned with a handful of dandelion greens and wild onions, he had the coffee brewing. "These will add some flavor to the bacon," she explained, setting to work washing and chopping the foraged greens. "And they're good for the blood, my grandmother always said." Nathan watched as she worked, her movements reminding him painfully of Sarah's morning routine. Both women approached domestic tasks with the same quiet competence, finding satisfaction in the simplest acts of creation. They ate in companionable silence, the bacon and greens forming a surprisingly satisfying meal. Afterward, as Bethany helped him clean up, she glanced out the window toward the stables. "Would it be presumptuous to ask for a ride to town? I know it's out of your way, but—" "It's fine," Nathan interrupted. "I need supplies anyway." Relief crossed her face. "Thank you. I'd hoped to avoid another long walk." An hour later, they were mounted on Storm, with Bethany seated behind Nathan, her carpet bag secured to the saddle. She had initially hesitated at the arrangement, suggesting she could walk alongside, but Nathan had dismissed the idea as impractical. "Town's 5 miles east," he explained. "Storm can carry us both without trouble." Now, with her arms tentatively encircling his waist to maintain balance, Nathan was acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd experienced human touch. It was unsettling, almost painful in its unfamiliarity. The morning was clear and cool, with the promise of warmth as the sun climbed higher. They rode mostly in silence, though occasionally Bethany would comment on the beauty of the landscape or ask a question about the territory. "How long have you lived here?" she inquired as they crested a hill that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. 5 years, Nathan replied. "Came out from Pennsylvania after the war, wanted open space and fewer memories." "The war changed many things," Bethany said softly. "Thomas never spoke of his time fighting, but I could see it in his eyes sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking." Nathan nodded, understanding all too well. Some things aren't meant to be spoken of. As they approached a bend in the trail, Nathan slowed Storm to a walk. Just ahead lay the valley where Sarah was buried. He had not intended to pass this way, but it was the most direct route to town. "This valley," Bethany remarked, taking in the picturesque scene, "it's beautiful." Nathan's throat tightened. "Yes." His tone must have conveyed more than he intended, for Bethany fell silent, her gaze following his to the solitary cross visible on a gentle rise among the wildflowers. "Your wife?" she asked quietly. Nathan nodded, unable to speak. Without warning, Bethany dismounted, startling both Nathan and Storm. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the grave. Confused but unwilling to deny such a simple request, Nathan dismounted as well, tethering Storm to a nearby tree. Together, they walked the short distance to Sarah's final resting place. Bethany knelt beside the cross, gently touching the carved letters of Sarah's name. "You made this yourself," she observed. "It wasn't a question." "Yes." Nathan stood a few paces back, uncomfortable with this unexpected detour but unwilling to rush her. To his surprise, Bethany began clearing away some of the overgrown grass around the base of the cross, her fingers working deftly to create a small cleared space. From her pocket, she produced a handful of seeds. "What are you doing?" Nathan asked, stepping forward. "Planting wildflowers," Bethany replied simply. "Different varieties than those already growing here. They'll bloom at different times, ensuring there's always color." She looked up at him. "If you'd rather I didn't." Nathan should have said no, should have told this stranger that she had no right to alter anything about Sarah's resting place. Instead, he found himself saying, "What kinds?" Bethany's expression softened. "Columbine, black-eyed Susans, and prairie clover. They're hardy and will return year after year with little tending." She carefully created small furrows in the soil with her finger. "My mother taught me that flowers speak when words fail us. These will say that she is remembered and loved, even when you cannot be here." Nathan watched in silence as Bethany planted the seeds, covering them gently and patting the earth firm. When she had finished, she rose and dusted off her hands. "Thank you," he said gruffly, surprised to find he meant it. Bethany nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It helps, sometimes, to do something tangible with grief, to put it to work creating beauty." They remounted in silence and continued toward town, but something had shifted between them. The shared moment at Sarah's grave had created a tentative connection, a mutual recognition of the complex nature of loss. As they approached the outskirts of the small settlement that served as the nearest town, Nathan found himself reluctant to part ways with Bethany. It was an unexpected feeling, one that left him unsettled and vaguely guilty, as though even such a minor attachment was somehow a betrayal of Sarah's memory. The town consisted of a single dirt street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, the sheriff's office, and a few other businesses catering to the needs of the scattered homesteaders and ranchers in the area. Nathan reined Storm to a stop in front of the general store. "Jenkins will know where to find your cousin," he said, helping Bethany dismount. "The stage to Jackson leaves tomorrow morning if you're continuing on." Bethany adjusted her skirts and looked up at him with a smile that conveyed genuine gratitude. "Thank you for your hospitality, Nathan. It was more than I had any right to expect." He shifted uncomfortably in the saddle. "It was nothing. Not to me," she said simply. She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Nathan took it in his own. Her grip was firm, her skin warm despite the morning chill. "May God watch over you." With that, she collected her carpet bag and turned toward the store entrance. Nathan remained where he was, watching as she disappeared inside, an inexplicable sense of loss washing over him. Old Jenkins emerged a moment later, his weathered face breaking into a grin at the sight of Nathan. "Well, if it ain't the hermit himself. Thought you might have turned wild by now, living all alone up there." Nathan dismounted, tying Storm to the hitching post. "Still civilized enough to know when I'm being manipulated, Jenkins. You had no business sending that woman to my cabin." Jenkins had the grace to look mildly abashed. "Now, Nathan, what was I supposed to do? Let a respectable lady fend for herself in the wilderness? Sarah would have had my hide." The mention of his wife sent a familiar pang through Nathan's chest. "Sarah's not here," he said flatly, "and I'm not in the business of taking in strays anymore." "Shame about that," Jenkins replied, his tone softening. "You two always did right by folks passing through. This territory could use more of that kindness, not less." Nathan changed the subject. I need supplies. Flour, coffee, bacon, ammunition for the Winchester. Jenkins nodded, leading the way inside. Got a shipment in yesterday. Fresh stuff, too. As Nathan followed the shopkeeper into the store, he caught sight of Bethany speaking with a middle-aged woman he recognized as Mrs. Palmer, the wife of the town's only doctor. Bethany glanced his way briefly, offering a small smile before returning her attention to Mrs. Palmer. Jenkins followed his gaze. Mrs. Wilson's quite something, ain't she? Educated, too. Says she's heading to Jackson to teach, but I was just telling her we could use a school teacher right here. Got enough children now to warrant one. Nathan grunted non-committally, though he had to admit that Bethany carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. My supplies, Jenkins. While Jenkins gathered the requested items, Nathan found himself half listening to the conversation between Bethany and Mrs. Palmer. At least until the stage tomorrow, Mrs. Palmer was saying. We have a spare room and my husband would be delighted to meet someone from Denver. He practiced there before we moved west. That's very kind of you, Bethany replied. I wouldn't want to impose. Nonsense. It's settled then. And I insist you join us for the social this evening at the church. Nothing fancy. Just some music and refreshments, but it'll give you a chance to meet some of the townspeople. Nathan stiffened at the mention of the social. He had forgotten it was the first Saturday of the month, when the small community gathered at the newly built church for an evening of socializing. Sarah had loved those gatherings, but Nathan hadn't attended a single one since her death. Here you are, Nathan, Jenkins said, placing the last of the supplies on the counter. That'll be $3.42. Nathan paid, his mind still half on the conversation across the store. As Jenkins wrapped the purchases, he lowered his voice conspiratorially. You should come tonight. Been too long since you showed your face at a social. I have no interest in socializing, Nathan replied curtly. Jenkins sighed. Sarah wouldn't want you living like a ghost, son. She'd want, don't. Nathan cut him off, his voice hard. Don't tell me what she would want. The older man raised his hands in surrender. Fair enough, but the invitation stands. Nathan collected his supplies and nodded a brusque farewell to Jenkins. As he turned to leave, he found Bethany watching him, a question in her eyes that he wasn't prepared to answer. With a tip of his hat in her direction, he exited the store and began securing his purchases to Storm's saddle. He was nearly finished when the store door opened, and Bethany emerged. She approached hesitantly, as though unsure of her welcome. Mrs. Palmer has invited me to stay with them until the stage departs tomorrow, she said. She also mentioned a social gathering tonight at the church. Nathan continued adjusting the saddle straps. Good. The Palmers are decent folks. Will you be attending the social? The directness of her question caught him off guard. He straightened, meeting her steady gaze. No, disappointment flickered across her face, quickly masked. I see. Well, I wanted to thank you again for your help, and to say. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, that I hope the flowers bring you some comfort when they bloom. There was something in her tone, a genuine concern that pierced through the walls Nathan had built around himself. For a moment, he was tempted to reconsider his decision about the social, to tell her that perhaps he would attend after all. But the moment passed, and he merely nodded. Safe travels to Jackson, Mrs. Wilson. Bethany, she corrected gently. After sharing a home, however briefly, I think we can dispense with formalities. Despite himself, Nathan felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward. Safe travels, Bethany. She smiled, the expression transforming her face in a way that made Nathan's breath catch unexpectedly. Goodbye, Nathan. God keep you. As he rode back to his cabin, Nathan found his thoughts returning repeatedly to Bethany, to her quiet strength, her gentle manner, the way she had planted seeds at Sarah's grave without asking permission, but somehow knowing it was the right thing to do. It had been a long time since anyone had surprised him in a pleasant way. The cabin seemed emptier than usual when he returned, the silence more oppressive. Nathan busied himself with chores, chopping wood, repairing a loose board on the porch, tending to the livestock, but his mind kept wandering to the social gathering that would be taking place that evening. Sarah would have wanted him to go. The thought came unbidden as he was feeding the chickens. She had always believed in the importance of community, of maintaining connections with others even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. By late afternoon, Nathan found himself standing before the small mirror in his bedroom, running a straight razor over his jawline for the first time in weeks. He told himself it was merely time to tidy up, that it had nothing to do with the social or with Bethany Wilson's unexpected appearance in his life. But as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Nathan saddled Storm once more, and, wearing his one good shirt and the leather vest Sarah had given him for their last Christmas together, headed back toward town. The small church was aglow with lamplight when he arrived, the sounds of conversation and laughter spilling out into the gathering dusk. Nathan hesitated at the hitching post, suddenly uncertain. It had been so long since he had willingly sought out the company of others. What if he had forgotten how? Nathan Blackwood, as I live and breathe. Dr. Palmer's booming voice cut through his doubts. The doctor was standing on the church steps, pipe in hand, his round face split in a welcoming grin. "Thought we'd lost you to the wilderness for good," Palmer continued, descending the steps to clap Nathan on the shoulder. "Good to see you, man, very good indeed." Nathan managed a nod. "Doctor, come in, come in. Martha's been keeping an eye out for you. Said our house guest was hoping you might appear." At the mention of Bethany, Nathan felt an uncomfortable warmth creep up his neck. "Mrs. Wilson mentioned the gathering, yes." Palmer's eyes twinkled knowingly, but he mercifully changed the subject as he guided Nathan into the church. "Jenkins tells me your wheat crop is coming along nicely this year. Planning to mill it yourself or bring it into town?" The interior of the church had been transformed for the social. The pews had been pushed to the walls, creating an open space in the center where several couples were dancing to the music provided by old Mr. Henderson on fiddle and young Billy Carson on harmonica. Tables laden with food and drink lined one wall, while clusters of townspeople stood in conversation throughout the room. Nathan immediately felt conspicuous, aware of the curious glances and whispered comments his arrival had provoked. It had been nearly a year since most of these people had seen him, and longer still since he had participated in a community event. "Nathan," Mrs. Palmer appeared at his side, her plump face flushed with pleasure. "I told Bethany you might come. She's over by the punch bowl. Go say hello while I steal my husband back. Mrs. Henderson needs his opinion on her boy's cough." Before Nathan could protest, the Palmers had moved away, leaving him standing alone at the edge of the gathering. For a moment, he considered leaving, retreating to the solitude he had grown accustomed to. Then he caught sight of Bethany across the room. She was engaged in conversation with the blacksmith's wife, laughing at something the other woman had said. She wore the same traveling dress, but her hair had been freshly arranged, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. The lamplight caught the auburn highlights, creating a warm halo effect that made Nathan's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. As though sensing his gaze, Bethany looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and her smile of recognition was like the first ray of sunlight after a long winter. Nathan made his way toward her, nodding stiffly to those who greeted him as he passed. By the time he reached the punch bowl, Bethany was alone, the blacksmith's wife having moved on to another conversation. "You came," Bethany said simply, her voice warm with what sounded like genuine pleasure. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. "Thought I should make an appearance. It's been a while." "I'm glad." She offered him a cup of punch, which he accepted awkwardly. "Mrs. Palmer has been pointing out everyone in town to me. It seems you're something of a local legend." Nathan frowned. "What do you mean?" "The reclusive war hero who single-handedly built the finest homestead in the territory, only to withdraw from society after tragedy struck." Bethany's tone was gentle, without mockery. "People here respect you, Nathan, and they worry about you." "They shouldn't," he said gruffly. "I'm fine." Bethany studied him over the rim of her punch cup. "Are you, truly?" The directness of her gaze was unsettling. Nathan found himself unable to offer his usual dismissive response. "I'm managing," he said finally. She nodded, accepting his answer without pressing further. "The Palmers have offered to introduce me to several families with school-aged children. Apparently, there's growing interest in establishing a proper school here rather than in Jackson." The change of subject was a relief. "This town could use a school," Nathan agreed. "Most children here get little formal education beyond what their parents can provide." "Were you educated, Nathan?" "Some. My father insisted on it, even though we were farmers. Said knowledge was the one thing that couldn't be taken from a man." The memory of his father, stern but fair, brought a momentary pang. He was right about that, at least. The conversation flowed more easily than Nathan had expected. Bethany was an attentive listener, drawing him out with questions about the territory, the challenges of homesteading, the crops that thrived in the high mountain soil. In turn, he found himself genuinely interested in her stories of Denver, of the teaching position she had held at a small private academy before her husband's illness had forced her to give it up. "Thomas encouraged me to continue," she explained as they moved away from the punch bowl to a quieter corner of the room. "Even when he was bedridden, he insisted I keep teaching. But in the end, I couldn't bear to be away from him during his final weeks. You have no regrets about that choice?" Nathan asked. Bethany considered the question thoughtfully. "About being with him at the end? No, but I do regret the years before, when I was sometimes too busy with my own pursuits to truly see him, to appreciate the time we had." She looked up at Nathan, her eyes reflecting the lamplight. "That's the cruel irony of loss, isn't it? It teaches us what truly matters, but only after it's too late to act on that knowledge." The observation struck too close to home. Nathan thought of all the times he had brushed aside Sarah's attempts to show him the beauty in their surroundings, too focused on the work that needed doing to pause and simply be present with her. Sarah loved wildflowers, he found himself saying. "Used to fill the cabin with them all summer long. I thought it was frivolous, wasting time gathering flowers when there was work to be done." He swallowed hard. "Now I'd give anything to see those mason jars lined up on our windowsill again." Bethany's hand touched his arm lightly. "She knew you loved her, Nathan. That's what matters in the end." The music had shifted to a slower tune, and several couples had moved to the center of the room to dance. Nathan became acutely aware of Bethany's proximity, of the gentle pressure of her hand on his arm. "Would you care to dance?" The words were out before he could reconsider them. Surprise flashed across Bethany's face, followed by a smile that reached her eyes. "I would like that very much." It had been years since Nathan had danced, not since before the war, at his younger sister's wedding. He was stiff and awkward at first, hyperconscious of the eyes watching them as he led Bethany to join the other couples. But as they began to move to the music, muscle memory took over, and he found a rhythm that felt natural. Bethany was light on her feet, following his lead effortlessly. The proper distance between them gradually lessened as the dance continued, until Nathan could feel the warmth of her presence, could detect the faint scent of lavender that must have come from Mrs. Palmer's soap. "You dance very well for a man who lives alone in the wilderness," Bethany teased gently. Nathan felt the unfamiliar sensation of a smile tugging at his lips. "My mother insisted all her children learn, said it was a civilized skill that would serve us well, no matter where life took us." "She was right," Bethany said, her eyes holding his. "Though I imagine she never pictured you dancing in a frontier church with a strange woman you found in your kitchen." The unexpected humor startled a genuine laugh from Nathan, a rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. "No, I don't believe that scenario occurred to her." The dance ended too soon, and as they returned to the edge of the room, Nathan was surprised to find himself reluctant to release Bethany's hand. When he finally did, the absence of her touch left an inexplicable emptiness. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of conversation, music, and more dancing. Nathan found himself being drawn back into the community he had shunned for the past year, accepting handshakes from men who had once been friends and kind words from women who had brought food to his cabin in the weeks following Sarah's death. Through it all, Bethany remained nearby, her presence somehow making the reintegration less overwhelming. She seemed to sense when he needed a moment of quiet and would deftly steer them toward a less crowded area, or engage others in conversation when Nathan ran out of words. It was well past midnight when the social began to wind down. Families with young children had departed hours earlier, and now even the most enthusiastic dancers were gathering their belongings and bidding goodnight to their neighbors. "I should return to the Palmers," Bethany said as they stood on the church steps, watching the last wagons depart. "The stage leaves early tomorrow." Nathan nodded, surprising himself with the disappointment her words evoked. "I'll walk you there." The night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant in the vast Wyoming sky. They walked in companionable silence for a time, their path lit by the full moon and the occasional lamp glowing in a window they passed. "Thank you for coming tonight," Bethany said finally. "I know it couldn't have been easy." Nathan considered her words. "It was better than I expected, because of the company." There was a hint of teasing in her voice, but also a question. "Yes," Nathan admitted, the darkness making honesty easier, "because of the company." They had reached the Palmers' home, a tidy two-story structure that served as both residence and doctor's office. A lamp still burned in the front window, left lit to guide their return. "Will you come to see me off tomorrow?" Bethany asked, pausing at the gate. Nathan hesitated. The thought of watching her leave, of returning to his solitary existence after this brief connection, filled him with an unexpected dread. "I don't know if that would be wise." In the moonlight, Bethany's expression was difficult to read, because it would be too hard to say goodbye. "Because I'm not sure I want to," Nathan admitted, the words surprising even himself. Bethany stepped closer, her face upturned to his. "Then don't say goodbye. Say you'll write to me in Jackson. Say you'll visit when you bring your wheat to market in the fall." "Bethany." Nathan's voice was rough with emotion he had thought long buried. "You don't understand. I'm not whole anymore, not since Sarah." "Do you think I am?" she asked softly. "We are both broken, Nathan. But perhaps that's why we recognize something in each other, the possibility that broken pieces can still fit together to make something new." The moonlight silvered her hair, casting her features in a gentle glow that made her look almost ethereal. Nathan found himself reaching out, his calloused fingers brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I buried my heart with my wife," he whispered, Bethany leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Then perhaps it's time to plant something new beside that grave, just as I planted flowers there. Not to replace what was lost, but to honor it by continuing to live." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of possibility heavy between them. Then, slowly, Nathan bent his head and brushed his lips against hers, a gesture so gentle it was barely a kiss, yet it sent a current of warmth through his entire body. When he pulled back, Bethany's eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Come tomorrow," she whispered. "Whatever you decide, at least come to say goodbye properly." Nathan nodded, unable to trust his voice. He watched as she entered the Palmer's home, the door closing softly behind her. Only then did he turn and begin the long walk back to his horse, his mind a tumult of conflicting emotions. The ride back to his cabin was a journey through memories and possibilities. Nathan thought of Sarah, of the life they had built together and the future that had been stolen from them. He thought of the lonely year that had followed, of the walls he had built around his grief to contain it. And he thought of Bethany, her gentle strength, her understanding, the way she had planted seeds at Sarah's grave as naturally as if she had known exactly what was needed. By the time he reached his cabin, dawn was breaking over the eastern mountains. Nathan unsaddled Storm and turned him out into the corral, then stood for a long moment, watching the first rays of sunlight touch the valley where Sarah lay. What would she have thought of Bethany? The question came unbidden, but once formed, it demanded an answer. Sarah, with her generous heart and practical mind, would have liked the schoolteacher from Denver, would have approved of her straightforward manner and her kindness, would have wanted Nathan to be happy again. The realization was both painful and liberating. Sarah had never been selfish in life. Why would she be in death? She would not want him to spend his remaining years alone, mourning what could not be changed. Nathan entered the cabin, the space seeming different somehow after Bethany's brief presence. He moved to the small trunk at the foot of his bed, the one place he had stored the personal items he couldn't bear to look at daily, but couldn't bring himself to discard. From within, he withdrew a small leather-bound journal, Sarah's diary. He had never read it, considering it a private conversation between Sarah and her God. Now he opened it carefully, the leather creaking slightly, and turned to the final entries. Sarah's neat handwriting filled the pages, detailing the everyday occurrences of their life together in the weeks before her death. Her observations were often humorous, sometimes profound, always infused with the love of life that had defined her. The final entry, dated just 2 days before the raid, caught Nathan's attention. "Nathan works too hard and thinks too much about what might go wrong. I wish he could see the blessings that surround us daily, the wildflowers that bloom despite the harsh conditions, the birds that build nests under our eaves, trusting us to let them raise their young in peace. Life is fragile but persistent. I pray that when hardship comes, as it surely will, we remember to look for the beauty that follows even the harshest winter." Nathan closed the journal, tears burning behind his eyes. Sarah had understood something he was only now beginning to grasp, that life continued, that beauty could follow devastation, that love was not a finite resource to be hoarded, but a renewable gift to be shared. With sudden clarity, Nathan knew what he needed to do. He changed into fresh clothes, packed a small bag with provisions, and saddled Storm once more. The stagecoach would be departing soon, and he had a decision to make. The town was already bustling when Nathan arrived, the stagecoach being prepared for departure outside the hotel. A small group had gathered to see off the passengers, including the Palmers and Bethany, who stood slightly apart, her carpet bag at her feet. She looked up as Nathan approached, hope and uncertainty mingling in her expression. He dismounted and moved to stand before her, suddenly conscious of the watching eyes of the townspeople. "You came," Bethany said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came," Nathan agreed. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Bethany, I don't know what the future holds. I can't promise that I won't still struggle with the past, but I do know that meeting you has awakened something I thought was dead, and I'm not ready to say goodbye." Joy blossomed on Bethany's face, transforming it in a way that made Nathan's heart race. "What are you saying, Nathan?" "I'm saying that I'd like you to consider staying. Not in Jackson, but here. The town needs a teacher and I—" He faltered, then found his resolve. "I need someone who understands what it means to lose everything and still find the courage to plant flowers." Bethany's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Are you certain this isn't a decision to make lightly?" "I've never been more certain," Nathan replied, surprised to find it was true. "It won't be easy. I'm not an easy man to know, and we're still strangers in many ways. But I'd like the chance to change that if you're willing." In answer, Bethany stepped forward and placed her hand on his cheek, a gesture so tender it nearly undid him. "I planted those seeds because I believed something beautiful could grow from loss," she said softly. "I still believe that, Nathan." The stagecoach driver called for passengers to board, breaking the moment. Bethany glanced toward the waiting vehicle, then back to Nathan. "Tell the driver he'll have one less passenger," Nathan said, his voice steadier than he felt. "And tell the Palmers you'll need lodging for a bit longer until we can make more permanent arrangements." Bethany's smile was answer enough. As she turned to inform the Palmers of her change in plans, Nathan looked toward the distant mountains, to the valley where Sarah rested. He could almost imagine her approval, could almost hear her saying that life was indeed persistent, finding a way to bloom even in the most unlikely places. In the weeks that followed, Nathan and Bethany moved carefully, building a friendship that grew deeper with each passing day. She took a room at the newly established boarding house in town and began organizing classes for the children of the area, using the church as a temporary schoolhouse until a proper building could be constructed. Nathan found himself drawn into the community once more, offering his carpentry skills to help build the schoolhouse, sharing his knowledge of farming with newer settlers, gradually reclaiming the man he had been before grief had consumed him. And every Sunday, without fail, they rode together to the valley, tending to Sarah's grave and the wildflowers that had begun to sprout from Bethany's seeds. It became a ritual of remembrance and renewal, a way of honoring the past while embracing the possibility of a future neither of them had expected to find. By midsummer, when the first of the black-eyed Susans bloomed beside Sarah's cross, Nathan asked Bethany to marry him. They stood among the wildflowers, the mountains bearing witness as she accepted with tears of joy streaming down her face. "She would approve, you know," Bethany said as they rode back to town that day, her arms wrapped securely around Nathan's waist. "Sarah would be happy that you found love again." Nathan covered her hand with his own, feeling a peace he had thought forever lost. "I know," he said simply. "She taught me how to love in the first place, and you taught me how to love again." They were married in the autumn as the aspen trees turned gold against the blue Wyoming sky. The entire town turned out for the celebration, Jenkins proudly standing as Nathan's best man, while Mrs. Palmer dabbed at her eyes throughout the ceremony. That evening, as they sat on the porch of what was now their cabin, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of crimson and gold, Bethany rested her head on Nathan's shoulder. "You remember what I said that night at the Palmers?" she asked. "About broken pieces fitting together to make something new," Nathan nodded, his arm tightening around her. "I remember." "I was right," she said softly. "We're still broken in our own ways. We still carry our losses. But together, we've created something beautiful from the fragments." In the fading light, Nathan could just make out the distant patch of wildflowers marking Sarah's grave, no longer a monument to grief alone, but a symbol of how love could transform even the deepest sorrow into something that nourished the soul. "Together," he agreed, pressing a kiss to Bethany's temple as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "That's how we'll face whatever comes next." And as night fell over the Wyoming wilderness, Nathan Blackwood held his second chance at happiness close, grateful for the unexpected gift of a woman who had planted hope beside his wife's grave, and in doing so, had helped his buried heart bloom once more. The years that followed brought changes to the valley that Nathan could never have imagined during those dark days after Sarah's death. The small settlement grew into a proper town, with Bethany's school at its heart. Children came from miles around to learn from the teacher who had a gift for nurturing both minds and spirits. Nathan expanded his homestead, using the carpentry skills he had honed during the war to build additions to the cabin as their family grew. First came William, born just 10 months after their wedding, a robust boy with his father's serious demeanor, but his mother's thoughtful eyes. 2 years later, they welcomed Sarah Elizabeth, named for the woman whose memory remained an honored presence in their home. Life was not without its hardships. Wyoming winters were brutal, and there were seasons when crops failed and resources grew scarce. But Nathan faced these challenges with a resilience born of having already survived the worst loss imaginable, and he no longer faced them alone. Bethany proved to be not just a loving wife but a true partner, as comfortable mending fences as she was teaching arithmetic, as capable of delivering a calf in an emergency as she was nurturing their children through illness. She brought laughter back into the cabin, along with music, teaching both children to play the small piano that Nathan had transported at great expense from Cheyenne as a surprise for her 30th birthday. The visits to Sarah's grave continued, becoming a family tradition. The wildflowers Bethany had planted that first day had multiplied and spread, creating a riot of color from early spring through late autumn. Nathan taught his children about the woman who had first made their home in the wilderness, ensuring that Sarah's memory remained a living presence rather than a shadow. "Your father loved your mother very much," Bethany would tell the children as they helped tend the flowers. "And she loved him enough to want him to be happy again, even after she was gone. That's how I knew it was right to love him too." It was on one such visit, as they picnicked beside the grave on the 10th anniversary of Sarah's death, that 7-year-old William asked the question Nathan had been anticipating for years. "Pa, you love Ma as much as you loved your first wife?" The simplicity of the question belied its complexity. Nathan looked at Bethany, who met his gaze with understanding, then back to his son's earnest face. "Love isn't something that can be measured like flour or compared like horses," he said carefully. "What I felt for Sarah was unique to her and our time together. What I feel for your mother is equally powerful but different, shaped by who we both were when we met and who we've become together." William considered this, his young brow furrowed in concentration. "So you don't have to love one person more than another. You can just love them differently." "Exactly," Bethany said, reaching over to smooth their son's hair. "Love expands to include all the people who matter to us, without diminishing what we feel for any of them." Later, as they rode home with William and little Sarah dozing against their parents' backs, Bethany leaned forward to speak softly in Nathan's ear. "You answered him beautifully," she said. "I've never doubted the place Sarah holds in your heart, just as I hope you've never doubted my respect for her memory." Nathan covered her hand with his own where it rested against his waist. Never, he assured her. You gave me permission to love again, Bethany. Not just with your words, but with your understanding of what she meant to me, what she still means. It's because I knew Thomas would want the same for me, she replied. Our first loves gave us the capacity to recognize love when it found us again. That's their enduring gift to us both. As their children grew, so did the community around them. Nathan, once the reluctant hermit, found himself increasingly involved in town affairs, serving on the council that governed local matters, helping to organize the yearly harvest festival, even occasionally stepping in to teach the older boys practical skills when Bethany's classroom became too crowded. The valley that had once been a place of solitary grief became the heart of their expanding world. Other families settled nearby, drawn by the fertile soil and the growing reputation of the settlement as a place where neighbors helped neighbors and newcomers were welcomed rather than viewed with suspicion. Through it all, Nathan and Bethany's bond deepened, weathering the inevitable storms of married life with the resilience of two people who had already endured the worst that fate could inflict. They argued, they reconciled, they supported each other through illness and setbacks, and they celebrated the small victories that marked their journey together. On their 15th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a tradition they had maintained since their first night as husband and wife, Bethany presented Nathan with a leather-bound book. "What's this?" he asked, turning it over in his hands. "Open it," she encouraged. Inside, he found pressed specimens of every wildflower that grew around Sarah's grave, carefully preserved and labeled in Bethany's elegant handwriting. Beneath each flower was a brief note recording a memory or milestone from their years together: William's first steps, Sarah Elizabeth's first day of school, the completion of the new barn, the Christmas when the entire town had been snowed in for a week. "It's a record of our life together," Bethany explained, her eyes shining with emotion. "Of all the beauty that's grown from what once seemed like barren ground." Nathan traced the delicate petals of a prairie clover, remembering the day Bethany had first planted its ancestors beside Sarah's grave. "It's perfect," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Just like the woman who created it." That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Nathan found himself reflecting on the strange, winding path that had led him to this moment of contentment. Had anyone told him, in those bleak days after Sarah's death, that he would one day find joy again, would father two healthy children, would help build a thriving community, would love a woman with a depth that matched, but did not diminish his first love, he would have dismissed them as cruel or foolish. Yet here he was, his arms around Bethany, the sounds of their sleeping children drifting from the adjoining rooms, the cabin warm and secure against the autumn chill. It was a life he could never have imagined, built on the ashes of dreams that had died with Sarah, but nourished by the hope Bethany had planted beside her grave. "What are you thinking about?" Bethany murmured, sensing his wakefulness. Nathan pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "About how sometimes the things we think will destroy us become the foundation for something we couldn't have built any other way." Bethany nodded against his chest, understanding as she always did. Life from death, hope from despair. It's the oldest story there is, but we each have to learn it in our own time. "You taught it to me," Nathan said simply, "when you planted those first seeds." As they drifted toward sleep, Nathan thought of the valley bathed in wildflowers, of the cross that stood as a memorial not just to what had been lost, but to what had been gained. Sarah would always be part of his story, just as Thomas remained part of Bethany's. But their greatest legacy was not the grief their deaths had caused, but the capacity for renewal they had unknowingly bequeathed to those who loved them. In the years that followed, as their children grew to adulthood and began families of their own, as the settlement expanded into a proper town with a name and a place on maps, Nathan and Bethany remained its heart and foundation. Their home became a gathering place for not just their own growing family, but for newcomers seeking advice, neighbors in need, and travelers passing through. And always, without fail, they tended the wildflowers in the valley, ensuring that Sarah's final resting place remained a place of beauty and peace. It was there, surrounded by the blooms that had become symbolic of their journey together, that Nathan finally understood the full meaning of what Bethany had done that day so many years ago. She hadn't just planted seeds in the earth. She had planted the possibility of healing in his heart. And from that simple act of faith had grown a life more abundant than he could ever have imagined, proof that even in the shadow of deepest loss, hope could take root and flourish, given time and tender care. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.